What's up, TSP fam? Super excited to share this episode with you guys where I talk all about personal philosophies with USC Sports Science Coordinator Kyle Voigt. In this podcast, he takes us through the entire PowerPoint presentation that helped him get the job he has today at USC. Fair warning, his video didn't work for the first 10 minutes for whatever reason, but then when he started his PowerPoint, it started working again, and then it continued working for the rest of the podcast. So I'm very excited. Let's get it going. Welcome to the Talking Shop podcast, where I'm going to share lessons and experiences and stories with sports performance and professional development. I'm joined with USC Sports Science Coordinator Kyle Voigt. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I'm sad that I have to hide myself on this, but my internet is not so great here in sunny Southern California.
We will conquer the internet and the LA 2:30 p.m. internet hold up. So just making do with what we can, being adaptable, being the best strength coaches and sports scientists we can be. So Kyle was on TSP 59, that is on YouTube and all major podcasting platforms. And the 1.0 episode, that first one, was all about his background, how he got to where he is now, some of his kind of personal life philosophies, things like that. But now we're going to take a deep dive on this episode specifically in just his personal philosophy, why he developed it, how you can do it yourself, and things like that. So not to get too much into your background, but I know that having a personal philosophy and kind of your PowerPoint presentation, just things like that, was pretty fundamental in kind of bringing you along your different stops in your career path. So if you could just touch on what role personal philosophy was had and how it's been in your life as a professional.
So just to start off, your personal philosophy obviously is going to be very, very personal to you and who you are as a professional and who you are as a person. In my opinion, they are one and the same. I don't think you can truly like pull them apart and say, okay, as a pro, this is what I am, and as a person, this is what I am. I think the biggest time I had to really sit down and think, okay, like, what do I actually believe in? When I was in my previous position at the University of Louisville. So I was working I was a strength coach for a couple teams. I was a sports scientist for a couple teams. And I really thought about it. I'm like, all right, what do I actually like doing? And I really realized, like, the weight room floor wasn't where I really wanted to be. Where I was super fascinated was looking at all these numbers. It was just fascinating to me to see that. So I really tried to think about, like, all right, how do I systematically look at this? How do I systematically look at who I am and relate it to why I like and love what I do? I started reading a lot, and one of the books I ran into that I guess a lot of young professionals read is Start With Why by Simon Sinek. So his whole thought process is most companies tell you what they do, they tell you how they do it, and then they tell you why they do it. Versus he brings up companies like Apple, right? So Apple tells you why they are what they are, how they do what they do, and then what they do. And I really liked that. It made a lot of intuitive sense to me. In my opinion, if you're going to define a personal philosophy, all it is why you do what you do, how you do what you do, and then what you choose to do. But the biggest thing I think we can take away from that is, like, your philosophy, like, whether or not you've defined it, you have one and you live one. And everything that you do epitomizes that philosophy. It's not a game you don't get to play. Like, you choose to have a philosophy, whether you have explicitly defined it or not. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, and so it's kind of flipping everything on its head, because you would think, okay, what is my job? How do I accomplish my job? And then why do I do it? But instead, kind of flipping it, like I said, and how the book said, where you start with why are you doing it, and then how you do your job, and then the what is kind of secondary, and what I like about personal philosophies, and whether it's defining core values or things along those lines, this being a little bit more specific to a profession, is I describe it as kind of like a roadmap and taking the guesswork out of it. Like, you have something concrete, and that's why I think it's important to write it down, because it's always there to reference. Not that it'll never change, which we'll get to later, but so practically, I know it's helped you in some presentations, whether it was at conferences or interviews, correct, if I'm not mistaken? Physically, like, without actually showing, but like, is it a PowerPoint? Is it like a Word document? Is it a note you keep on your phone? What do you think is the most effective way in keeping track and just organizing your why, how, and what?
I think one of the things is possibly keeping a journal. I'll be completely honest. I've really struggled with keeping a journal over the years, whether that was electronically, actually buying a hard copy journal. Like, I just really struggled with actually like, hey, this is where I keep all of this stuff. The reason why I say it's important to have that is because then it can let you look back at that and say, okay, how did I actually spend my time? If I'm trying to define myself as X person, am I actually living up to being that person? Am I doing what I'm saying that I'm doing?
Yeah, all this is fine and dandy, kind of theoretically and up in the cloud, being all meta and stuff. But if
Sure.
we're like, what does it actually look like? Not developing it, but like just to wrap our heads around what a personal philosophy is. So
I
we
mean,
can
a
like,
personal philosophy is why you do what you do, how you do what you do, and then what you choose to do. The biggest thing is that like you automatically stand for something. So concretely, let's just say, all right, let's apply your personal philosophy. Let's look at myself as a practitioner, right? What defines me as a person is simple stuff like, what time do I show up to work? Do I always show up at the same time? Do I show up early? Do I show up on time? Do I show up late? How do I spend my time when I'm at work? Am I constantly doing something? Am I constantly busy? Like, am I someone that just isn't super organized? Am I someone that is organized? Do I have an open door policy, or am I'm a closed door practitioner? And then how and what do I communicate with people around me? And that might sound like, oh, that's just like what I do all day. Like, yeah, but that makes up your personal philosophy. That makes up who you are as a person, because what you do is reflective of how you're doing your job, and that's reflective of your why. You don't do things that aren't in line with your values, which aren't in line with your ultimate philosophy.
exactly. And having those in an organized fashion and developing a personal philosophy, which we'll get into like concrete things. And kind of like you mentioned earlier, it could be a journal, it could be a PowerPoint presentation, a Word document, whatever it may be. Having it written down, not only committing to actually processing it and trying to formulate your own personal philosophy, but by having it down on paper, it's just kind of like goals. Like you're setting goals for yourself. You're saying, I'm going to abide to these standards that I'm making for myself, kind of like you said earlier. If it's out there in writing, it's going to guide you. It's there to reference whenever you're confused and you don't know what to do. So I think that's one of the biggest benefits to having a personal philosophy, at least written down, is it takes out the guesswork, kind of like I said earlier. And that's why I think that there's so much value in committing to developing a personal philosophy, because
Yeah,
like you said, there's all of these things that constitute your day. But imagine if you already knew how you were going to go about every little aspect of your day, then you just have to go and crush it.
there we go.
Boom.
Cool.
We
All right.
conquered. Here we
So
are.
can you see my screen right here?
I can.
Right on. So this was a portfolio that I actually presented, and I actually made like a binder. So try to make it somewhat professional looking, that I gave to the director of football, strength conditioning, Olympic sports, sports med, and then my direct boss, who was associate AD for sports science performance, right? So tailored specifically to those people. Started with a quote that I think defines like what I'm about, which is, I mean, Jackie Robinson's big influence on me and what he was about. It's about making an impact on other people. So I showed a journey, like that was my journey. I went from an undergrad at SC to UCLA, back to SC, back to UCLA to Louisville. So, I mean, we've talked about this in a previous podcast, but I basically took my philosophy and said, why do I do what I do? And it's to help other people achieve their goals. Simply put, that's my why. That's why I wake up every morning. That's why I do what I do, to help other people achieve their goals. How? Broke it down into 3 values, which was Kaizen, enjoyment, and selflessness. So Kaizen is a is a Japanese principle basically for continuous improvement. That's what I'm about. Is, okay, how can I get better every single day? Enjoyment is you've got to enjoy what you do. Like, if you just hate what you do, it's not in line with who you are as a person. And then selflessness. It's about other people. It's never about me. The what, and this is basically looking and alluding to those hows, which is relationships are more important than data. Like those soft skills, being able to actually have a conversation with one of our players is more important than knowing how to run logistical regression or building out a machine learning algorithm. Like that's not going to be what ultimately helps. It's going to be that relationship I have with the people around me. And then stole this shamelessly from the All Blacks, but it's better people make better Trojans. Like I sincerely believe that if you are a better person, you will be a better whatever you do. And then a rising tide lifts all ships. And that just simply means if I get better, it makes everyone else around me better. If people around me get better, that forces me to have to lift my game. So just right off the bat, like we just went through a why, a how, and a what. And this is what defines me as a person. I want to help other people achieve their goals. I do that by trying to get better, loving what I do, and loving on other people. And what do I actually do is I build relationships with people. I help other people become better people. And I raise my game, so everyone around me has to raise their game as well. This is something that I view as incredibly important because ultimately, what you do does not matter if your why isn't as strong as humanly possible. Because the why is going to keep you coming back every single day to work. So the next one is like, why do I even do sports science? Because what gets measured gets managed. One of the most basic quotes you'll ever see, right? So my why for sports science. So I gave you my why and how and my what for me as a person. And this is my why relating specifically to the role that I wanted to be in. So my why is to apply scientific principles to enhance sporting performance. Use science to help us perform better in sports. How do I do that? Basically the same thing as the other house. It's all about relationships, measuring what matters, and being adaptable. So it's all about people. It's all about what's going to make the boat go faster. And either we win or we're going to get better. Because you cannot win every game. Maybe you will in a season. Maybe you will over 2 seasons, but I guarantee you, you will not win every game over the course of your career. So you've got to learn how to learn. And then my what, so just 5 C's: collaboration, communication, commitment, competition, and community. So working together, talking to people. You'd be surprised how difficult that actually ends up being sometimes. Commitment. So taking the analogy from Hernan Cortez basically burning the boats when he landed in South America to take over the entire country. Obviously, he committed some terrible atrocities, so I'm not going to get into that. But being committed. And then competition. Wanting people to compete with wanting other people to compete, and also I'm competitive. We're going to play the University of Alabama. I want to be someone who helps us win that game. And then a community, right? So that's my why, my how, and then my what, specifically relating to the role that I went in. So then I basically broke down, okay, this is everyone that surrounds a student athlete. And then ultimately, how do we help win games? How do I help people win games? So I think the number one thing, at least in college, to understand is what is that scoreboard? For your football team, that might be winning a national championship. It might be winning a Pac-12 championship. For your soccer team, same thing. For your athletic department, most athletic departments actually use something called the Learfield Cup, the Director's Cup, to determine how successful their athletic department is. So this is something I made. Basically took the final ranking of USC compared to the total number of points. So basically what the Learfield Cup does is it takes 19 sports across every athletic department in the country and then takes the final ranking of that sport and assigns it a point total. So basically from here you can see this year USC ranked 8th, then they were 3rd, then they were 4, then they were 4, then they were 4. So my goal is to affect that scoreboard. My goal is to take this and make us 3 and then 2 and then ultimately number 1 to help us be the best collegiate program in the country. This is a direct quote I actually got from a coach I used to work for. which is I don't care about your research paper. I need to win games, right? So, I mean, a lot of people in positions like mine think about the long term, possibly writing papers, possibly developing a new technique, but ultimately coaches care about winning games. Athletes care about winning games and having great performances. So I think that's got to be something that's in the practitioner's mind. So then my primary objectives are, 1, I've got to help the team win. 2, I've got to make sure players are ready to play. And 3, I've got to make sure the players that are ready to play are ready to perform at their best level. So team success is the number one thing. What defines a USC student athlete? Because, I mean, just from conversations you and I have had, Matt, a USC student athlete is different from a TCU student athlete, which is different from a University of Louisville student athlete, which is different than athletes at other universities, and professional versus high school. Like, what defines a USC student athlete and how can I help them? So, okay, I know the student athlete needs to develop these 4 areas in order to perform at a really high level. So they need to know their sport. They need to have the skills required for said sport. They need to be physically prepared, and then they need to be psychologically ready for that sport. You add all these things together, you get a high performance. This is another thing that I thought was important to share, which is, hey, you have your sport coach at the top, which is going to dictate how you play your game. Most sports are broken down into defense versus offense. How do you do things on offense? How do you do things on defense? What about the transitions of the game? And that's ultimately going to make your team philosophy, right? I don't share this to say, oh, like, I'm going to help the sport coach develop their strategy. No, I'm saying, where is my place within this? So number 2 objective is player availability, right? So they did a study in the 2016-2017 NFL regular season, and number of players on injured reserve versus regular season wins. Teams that had more players on the injured reserve had less success. They lost more games. When teams have players available to play, they are more likely to win. We can break down potential injury risks into non-modifiable and modifiable injury risks. So what is a non-modifiable risk? That's someone's age. Can't make someone younger. Previous injuries, you can't modify those. Training history, you can't necessarily modify that. There are some things that you got to take them as they are. And then you have modifiable things like, all right, what are your lifestyle habits? What position do you play? What's your body composition? What's your skill level? What's your strength levels? These are all things that we can modify. And then I like calling them training load moderators. All right, you have structure specific and you have sport specific. Structure specific are built in the weight room. That's strength and conditioning's job. Sport specific, that's on the field, in the film room. Okay, where are these loads coming from? And then how do we make sure that they're in line to ultimately make sure that the player can play? Please stop me if you want me to stop anywhere, but this is basically like straight up what I showed people. So this is an example from University of Louisville women's basketball, which is the team I worked with. So my big thing was, all right, what's the plan? Let's execute the plan, and then let's modify the plan. So what's the plan? So this is actually a player load forecast over the course of a week for our women's basketball team. Okay, what's our practice schedule going to look like? These are our games. Okay, what are going to be the individual players' loads across those days? And then I have players that actually play a lot and then reserves. Okay, that's the plan. Great. Did we execute the plan? All right. Here's how much work they did. This is how they got all that work. And then do we even need to modify the plan? All right. We're looking at loading over time. Are we actually doing what we set out to do? All right. So we're looking at loads over time. We're looking at how are they recovering sleep-wise? And then how are they feeling in terms of their overall wellness? So to just reiterate, what's the plan? Did we execute said plan? And do we even need to modify it? So it's less about the technologies. It's less about necessarily even the methods that you use. It's more to do with the system that you build. right? Like, I don't have this sleep technology now that I did there. I don't have the ability to do wellness like I did there. I don't even work with basketball anymore, but the concepts and the system still applies. And then number 3 objective is performance. So that's about monitoring things daily, planning things weekly, and then monitoring monthly adaptation in all 4 of these different coactives. Another example would be men's soccer. So same 3 things. Okay, what was the session objective? We wanted to work on switching the point of attack. These are the drills that we did to get that. Awesome. Weekly monitoring. Our goal was to beat Indiana, all right? We wanted to make sure that what we did was putting us in a position to have a good performance. And then monthly adaptation, okay? The goal of our spring was to change the game mentality. We had a new coach, wanted to do things differently. Are we adapting well to training, right? And then I ended it with basically saying, why USC? And that one I actually don't have another slide for, but I actually do have it down the bottom here. And USC for me is a no-brainer. It's personal. USC is my alma mater, and my family is USC family. And it's USC traditionally is one of the best college programs across all sports, and I wanted to be a part of that. And then opportunity, because sports science and applied sports science at that is such a young profession in college in particular. And I just saw an incredible opportunity for growth with that at USC. So that's basically how I structured my portfolio for my job interview process. So now you just got me. So that's the whole thing. I literally put that in a book and I gave it to all these guys. My boss right now at USC still has that on his desk. And I didn't show you anything there that was revolutionary. I didn't show you anything there that was going to change the world or even change the university. But all I did was systematically list, who am I, what am I about, and how am I going to do my job?
And I like when you got into the specific examples, how you mentioned, well, these specific examples don't really matter if the stuff at the beginning of the PowerPoint wasn't a thing, and how I'm a proponent of simplicity when it comes to presenting and stuff like that. And it's like, when someone hears personal philosophy, it's this big, long, deep, emotional essay novel thing you write. No, that was no more than 15 words a slide, and what was that, 15 slides total? And it's just, but I can tell as much thought went into that as you probably could put into a whole novel, but it's important because that's your reference point. Whenever it comes time to do whatever it may be, apply for a job, handle a meeting with the rest of your staff and things like that, because you already know. And I think that's the biggest thing. I'll go back to it, because if we talk about how practical is it, how applicable is it? Well, it's applicable because it literally affects everything you do, down to the simplest things. So what kind of inspired you to embark on that journey of making a personal philosophy PowerPoint? Was it that conference, or was it your own doing, or was it part of your fellowship when you were at Louisville, or how did that come to be?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I did a series of internships, right? I did 1 graduate assistantship and 3 internships before I got a full-time role. So because of that, most internships put you through, and you could probably speak to this as well. They make you write programs. They make you basically list out, what do you believe in? What's your coaching philosophy? What's your personal philosophy? What do you believe? A lot of them will actually make you do that, because that's a huge part. And also, most of the time, internships are for certain universities turn into feeders for that university. My old boss at UCLA, he's really, really fond of his interns. People that have interned for him, he's very fond of them. because they learned his system. They learned how to do things the way that he deems to be correct. So what really inspired me was I made a very similar PowerPoint as like my internship project when I was at Louisville. So they basically gave me men's soccer and it was, all right, you're the sports science guy and you're the strength coach for men's soccer. If you had it your way, what would you do? Oh, and I was like, man, what would I do with this team? And I just started brainstorming, and it was, I would do this, I would do this, I would do this, all this stuff. And yeah, you might, but you got to trim a lot of that stuff down. And then I thought about it really, really clearly. And I'm like, if I document this and I do this really, really well, this is something I can keep with me. This is something that I can have to work off of as a template. So I was like, I'm going to throw myself into this. So I spent at least 100 hours on that thing. And it was like 100-something slides. And it was very similar format, just a lot more detailed. Basically, what's my why? If I'm the fitness coach for a men's soccer team at the college level, how do I do my job? Right? So that's what inspired me to make that. And I really just thought about it. I said, if I wanted to get a job, and I've already got the interview, they flew me across the country. So I was like, all right, obviously I'm a serious candidate. What can I do to set myself apart? I was like, well, if I leave something there that they now have, they could throw it away. Sure, they could throw it away. And some of them probably did. Totally okay with me. But now you have a reason for them to be like, oh, I see this guy's name. I have something of this guy's. Oh, I might just take a look at that. It's like, wow, this is pretty organized. Okay. Because the reports I make now don't look so different than those. I'm telling you my why, I'm telling you my how, and I'm giving you my what. And you can either love that or you can hate that. But that's who I am.
I love it. I love it. So simple, but so much time, but it makes so much sense, at least to me. So I think we've done a pretty good job of establishing what a personal philosophy is, what it can look like, why it's worth making this podcast, why it's worth making a personal philosophy. So let's say we've committed. All right, all in. Kyle, lead us to the promised land. Now what? What's the first steps? What's the process in going from idea, I want to do it, to actually having something concrete that is theirs?
That's a good question. Sorry, we're committed. Like, I want to put this on paper. All right. The first step is you've got to really sit down and you've got to define that for yourself. So by asking yourself, what is my personal philosophy? Just putting that on the top of a piece of paper. What you're really asking is, why do I do what I do? How do I spend my time? And then what do I actually do? You can say that you're about certain things, but your philosophy, it's all about what you actually do with your time. If you spend 10 to 12 hours a day watching Netflix, that's your part of your philosophy. I'm not against binge watching Netflix. There's a time and a place for everything. But ultimately, what you do is going to define who you are. So Simon Sinek in that book, Start With Why, talks about people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. Your why is going to show through your what. So I think the number one thing you can do, and just to give you like a step-by-step, number one would just be sit down with a piece of paper or your computer and brainstorm. And just confirm, like, what is my why as a person and then as a practitioner? Like, all right, it might be easier to start from a professional standpoint because that's kind of how people have chose to define themselves, at least myself. I choose to define myself as a practitioner a lot of the time. So sit down and figure out, why are you doing all this work? And then as a person, why do you do what you do? Like, why are you here? What is your purpose? And then second, determine what those values and beliefs are that help develop and express that why. And then the last thing is actually like look at what you do on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis to display those values, right? That's the big thing is, okay, I have this why. What do I actually do? And that's a really hard thing to do because you've defined that why, you've defined your how, and now you look at your what, And you might not like what you're doing with that what. You might not see that what corresponding with your how and your why. And that's a thing that it's a really hard question. So when we talking about personal philosophy, like I thought really hard about it because it's a difficult topic. It's an incredibly personal topic.
But that's why it's important to do, because what you do composes you as a professional, right? Your opportunity to advance, to get more jobs, to create a better life for yourself, more satisfaction, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one thing why I think it's super worth it, is if we want to make the best what for ourselves and our athletes, the people that we can impact, well, we can kind of jumpstart that by giving us a roadmap, and how easy is it to figure out what to do all day if you already have your why and your how aligned? And I like how you kind of referenced that it was more of a process, and I would assume after our initial talk, I tried to make a little PowerPoint. It's definitely a lot harder than it seems, but it's this process of like, write all of it down, brainstorm, take a few days off. Okay, now pick the top, now cut it in half, and then try making a few PowerPoint slides, take a week off, and then, all right, cut that in half, and then rework that out. And if it is something that's concrete because it's in writing, but it's more of like a kind of free flowing thing. I don't know. I've never done it myself. I've tried, but I'm trying to rephrase into how it looks like actually in that process. That it is a process is what I'm trying to get at.
Absolutely. And it's not an easy one. That's what I'm really trying to reiterate. And it's not a one size fits all process either. Like you might have a different way of defining it than I did. Like I work well off of systems. Like I like routines. I like knowing what the organization is like, and then working from there. You give me a set template. The cool thing about philosophy, man, is like you get to define that template. If you don't want to do your a why, how, and what, you can change that however you would like. Like you get to define who you are. Like you get to choose that. Now, other people are going to have opinions on that, and how much you allow them to have an opinion, how much you allow that to affect yourself is a whole nother topic in and of itself. But ultimately, you get to define your philosophy. I think that's an important thing to remember.
Yeah, and it can be super intimidating potentially. It's like I have all of this control. It can literally be whatever I want it to be. And being someone who's been in, science and research, where it's like, well, there's this very laid out process of like how you do a thesis, how you construct this and every little step, and having, it's not artistic, but it's more gray, I guess, because you have literally complete autonomy on everything. Like your PowerPoint is how it works for you and what you believe in. And my PowerPoint can have the same concept, but it can look a gazillion different ways. So I would say, like, the best time to start something was 20 years ago, and the second best time was now. The best time to go through 20 drafts of your personal philosophy was however long ago it was. So it's like, why don't you start doing it right now? Which is, of course, easier said than done, but yeah, I think that there's a ton of value in it. And so you personally, I guess, getting into our last big question, what's your process? What's your reflection, modification, tweaking process look like?
For me personally, I think your philosophy changes, very small changes every single day. Like I genuinely believe that if you still think and believe and do the same things you did when you first came up with your philosophy years ago, I don't think you're taking in the information. I don't think you're taking in new things that are making you think differently. So it's something that's got to be modified almost daily. Like I look back at that portfolio I showed you, and I'm like, I wouldn't have presented that much information to that women's basketball staff. Like that was probably too much information. Like I look back at some of those reports, and I'm like, I look back at some of those, like those 5 C's I had for my practitioner one, and I was like, it's kind of a lot. It's kind of redundant. Do I really need all of those? But the biggest reason I think it's important to just even list those out and to be okay with modifying and tweaking it is because it actually gives you answers to a lot of interview questions. So speaking directly to a job interview, and let's not mistake it, like when I'm at work every single day at SC, like it's a job interview. How I conduct my business and how I do what I do is a job interview. Because let's say something happens, or let's say it's a couple years down the road and another coach has left to go to a different place, or hey, this opportunity presented itself, and people always know people in athletics. I don't know. That person might talk to that person, and then I might be in line for something different. You know, like that's why I think it's so important to one, establish it and write it down, but then to be okay with changing it. Like a perfect example, like an interview question is, I've gotten this interview question a couple times now. It's like, why do you show up to work every day? What's your why? Okay, now you have that defined. You don't want it to sound like you were anticipating the question, obviously. You want to like take a second, think about it, and then you have a concrete answer for it. And okay, then they might ask you, okay, like how do you see yourself in this role? How do you fit that role? Now you've actually answered the question already. You see how you fit in that role. You've read the job description and you see whether you're the right person for that job or not. And then they might ask you a question of, hey, you talk a really good game. Can you actually show me? Can you actually show me that you know what you're talking about? And I've seen this with several strength conditioning, like specific interviews, where they make the person coach during the interview. And they'll just say if you can do what you're talking about or not, or they'll pull up a whiteboard and make you actually like start programming in front of them. Like they're gonna test you, because these colleges, if we're talking college specifically, or even pro teams, they're making an investment in you as a person. Like it's a big investment for them too, and they're trying to make the best decision they can with the information that they have. So yes, defining a personal philosophy is great, but if you can't do the what, your why might not be good enough. But the last thing I will say on that is, when I was in business school in my undergrad, the biggest thing I took from one of these classes, which is actually basically teaching you how to get a job, was an employer is way more likely to take a chance on someone who has the opportunity to grow into a role than a person that is fully qualified for that role but isn't the right person for that job. So I don't want to say I'm going to end it with this, but I actually said this in my USC interview. I said, if I'm not the right person for this job, don't hire me. Like, do not hire me. And trust me, that was a ballsy thing to say, because I didn't have a job, right? Like, I didn't have some safety blanket to sit down on and be like, all right, we're going to be good if this doesn't work out. Like, I needed a job. But I just knew that if I wasn't the right person for that job and I was there, no one would be happy and no one would think that we made the right decision. Like, you have to have the courage to know whether you're making the right decision for yourself and if you're making sure that other people are making the right decision as well.
And you know how you figure out if it's the right job or not? If you have your personal philosophy figured out. Boom, yep. Bringing it full circle. And yep. I love that quote about the every day of your job is a job interview. Not to put so much pressure in where you have to become a robot 24/7, but just understand that like you as a professional is what you do as a professional, like every day. Like what makes you professional is you doing your job. Not to sound super redundant, but how much, and like just this flow of why, how, what, and how it goes both ways. You know, if you want to do what you want to do, well, figure out the why and the how. And if you spend all this time on the why and the how, then it makes the what, you don't even have to give it a second thought. And just like that flow of everything like that. And then tying the tweaking the original question into actionable things. Because I've looked back at my old reports I used to give the beach team, and I'm like, how did I let myself, like it was bad. But it's more just like taking notes. I'm like, okay, like less this, don't mention that. Oh, well, maybe next time I should try printing out a set of speaking notes instead of just going off the top of my head. And it's like, if you take a bullet point or two or three from every report, or just every week, let's just say you reflect once a week, and let's say an academic year, it's 30 weeks. If you have 30 to 90 bullet points on how you can get better as a practitioner on actionable things you do every day, I think you're going to get better, in my opinion. And I think that that's a pretty halfway decent policy in how to improve yourself, but also your personal philosophy. And it can be, cringy and tough going through your old work. Like people hate listening to themselves. Well, I listen to myself speak when I go through these interviews every time, but it's part of the process. And with every podcast, I get that much better. And, not to be all optimistic and cliche and sunshine and rainbows, but like, if you're intentional on wanting to do the best what, then you know that you have to figure out your why and your how. And then you put your time in there, and then it's this, everything's related, but it's different, but it all flows, and it's a process. And I know that everyone knows what I'm talking about, but I'm going to give the floor to you if you have anything else prepared or kind of any other thoughts before we wrap it up.
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway, if anyone's watching this and is like, all right, like I want to go out and actually write down my personal philosophy, I think the biggest thing that I would advise is don't get hung up on the what. Don't get hung up on what you actually do every single day, because it's all about aligning with the why. It's all about the why. Like if I'm making a report that I think is the greatest report ever, but my end user cannot use that report, I'm wrong. I am wrong, because my goal is to help other people achieve their goals. My why is to help use scientific principles to enhance sporting performance. If people aren't using the information that are going to enhance sporting performance, I'm not aligning with my why. And that's when you start having some real issues. So that's the biggest thing that if anyone's taking anything out of this, like that's the number one thing, is don't get hung up on the why. Just be really, really strong about what that why is and that how. I don't know if I just said don't get hung up on the why. Don't get hung up on the what.
On the what, yeah.
On the what, my bad.
And that was in your PowerPoint. You also said the same thing, and I think that's super important, because it is super easy to get caught up in those like super, not minute, but like those actionable things and what you really do. But if you kind of take a step back, which is I think kind of a theme of this whole thing, is the why and the how, it'll take care of the what. And especially when it comes to jobs, because I'm going through my own job search right now in regards to job descriptions and things like that. A majority of the people that I've talked to, especially because like strength and conditioning is kind of a half adopting this sports sciencey thing, but it's also kind of half making its own way. And then people that I talk to have made their own transitions, and it's like half of them either wrote their own job description, or the job description on the website is nowhere near what they do now. So that's just one example of how the what isn't necessarily what it's cracked up to be, and definitely should not have as much stock put into it as the first two for sure. So I totally agree. And I think we conquered the internet. We figured out screen share. I think this was an awesome episode. So I'm going to say thank you, open it up for one last remark, and we'll say goodbye.
Yeah. Hey, really, really appreciate you having me on again, Matt. It's great chatting with you. Obviously, just please keep me up to date about what's going on with you and your career. And I'm just ready to get back to work, man. So thanks for listening, guys.
Fantastic.